Now that we've proven God through intelligent design, I want to go on to the next stage of, call it our journey, which is something called the first cause proof, if you'd like. I don't see this so much as a proof, meaning to say it is a very good proof. It is a tremendous proof, actually, for the existence of God. But I think it's more than that. I think it's actually the most fundamental and important thing you need to understand God, which by definition then means by Torah, Judaism, and probably the most important thing in your life, one of the most important things. So I think it's very, very foundational, very fundamental to understand this. I think that's why it pays to take step by step. So we have to make sure we have a very clear understanding of this concept, what it means to be the first cause. Because really, what do we mean when we say God? God is a term. Like, the terms need understandings. When I throw out a word, I have to have a conceptual understanding of what that word means, or at least a very basic understanding of what that word means. If I were to ask you to define what God is, which means you have to give me a description of God without using the word God, what would you say? How would you even approach it? So we want to understand what it means, God, what Hashem means, Yud Ke Vav Ke, what do you think mean? And to me, this is the best, most fundamental way of understanding it. So let's establish, we have to establish certain axioms, certain truths, and then we could finally fully understand what we mean when we say the Jewish conception of what God is. Okay, so let's start one thing at a time. There are a couple of, we'll call them introductions, although I think they're already part of the idea, but we'll call them introductions anyways, that we have to get through to understand this. The first thing comes in the form of a riddle. And it's a very famous riddle. Many have spoken about this riddle, but I'm going to give it my own take on it, my own way of presenting it as well. So the riddle goes like this. If you take the space between myself and the door, so let's say there's 1 meter between myself and the door. Now, if you were to divide that space, you would have 2 pieces, each of a ½ meter. If you divide those 2 pieces into 2, you'd have 4 pieces, each of a ¼ meter, and so on and so forth. Now, how long can you go dividing these pieces before you get to, like, we'll call it 0? The answer is forever. You could keep dividing these pieces forever. Forgetting about the technicality of splitting the atom. So it doesn't make a difference. We're talking about in theory. Also, if you'd like to hear it better, you could say divide the space as opposed to actual cutting it up. Just divide the space. It doesn't make a difference. The point is, if you keep dividing the space, keep cutting up those pieces, you'll never get to 0, because there would be no point where you'll cut up and you keep going smaller and smaller. Space could keep going on and on. The space there will keep going on, and you will never get to 0. Never get to nothing. You could keep dividing that space forever and ever and ever. So how many times can I divide that space into myself and the door? The answer we'll say is infinite. It's infinite, never-ending amount of times that you could divide the space between myself and the door. So the amount of pieces that you'll have will be infinite, never-ending. Infinite amount of pieces between myself and the door. Because again, you could keep cutting that space forever. If that's true, that there's an infinite amount of spaces between myself and the door, then the obvious question is, then how do I ever reach the door? If infinite means never ending, infinite by definition is that it never ends. So then if the spaces between myself and the door never end, then how can I ever reach the end of the door? If I tell you to follow the yellow brick road and that yellow brick road never ends, so you should be never able to get to the end of that yellow brick road. So same thing here. If the spaces, the pieces between myself and the door are infinite, never ending, then how is it that I'm able to traverse that space, to cross that space, and actually ever get to the door? So that's a riddle, a question. Call it paradoxical. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but it's a question that philosophers and scientists talk about a little bit. Okay, so here's going to be the answer to this question, and it's going to be a very important answer, and we're going to build with this answer. The answer to this question is very, very simple. The answer is that no matter how many times you cut or divide the space between myself and the door, you will always have a finite amount of spaces between myself and the door. So if I cut 1 time, I'll have 2. If I cut another couple of times, 4, and then 8, and then 12, and then 16, whatever it is, there will never be a point where the amount of spaces that you have will be infinite. That is not a thing. If they have an amount, then the amount is going to be finite. Let's take it in a different way. Let's say I were to tell you that the amount of grains of sand there are in the universe. How many are there? Well, if I count some of them, so I have 5 in my hand, 5 little grains of sand in my hand. Okay, now the ocean, the beach, is just those grains of sand that I have in my hand, just more. It's the same exactly thing, it's just more. So I add another one, another one, another one until I get the entire amount of grains of sand in the world. Tell me, is the amount of grains of sand finite or infinite? So the answer is going to be finite. And the reason is, the same reason we just established, is because infinity is not a large number that eventually one day you'll get to. In fact, you will never get to infinity. I could keep counting numbers forever, and I'll never get to the number infinity. And there is a difference between the idea of infinity and the idea of never ending. Never ending is, let's say, the digits, the amount of numbers that you have, that's never ending. The little spaces that you could divide between myself and the door, that's never ending. But that's not infinite. It's always a finite amount. It's always an amount. Again, if I have 10 spaces, 20 spaces, 30 spaces, 100 spaces, a billion spaces, 2 billion, I will never have an infinite amount of spaces, just like I'll never have an infinite amount of grains of sand. It will always be finite amount, and the spaces will always be a finite amount, and therefore I could cross that space. If I have two spaces, each of half a meter, I could cross half a meter. Half a meter is only half, not a third, not a half, not the whole thing, excuse me. So it's limited. So if I cross half a meter, I could cross half a meter twice, and that's it. I could cross the space from myself, from where I am to the door, and I could reach the door. It doesn't make a difference how many times you divide that space, you'll be able to cross it. If you want another way of thinking about it, there's a space of 1 meter. When I cross it, I could cross 1 meter. I'm not adding spaces when I'm dividing them. I'm taking the space and just dividing it. I'm not adding more space. So once I could cross 1 meter, I cross 1 meter. The point is that the division, the amount of pieces that I go within the space is always going to be finite, and therefore it will always have an end. Same thing with the grains of sand, it will always be finite. So we come to our first point that's super important, which is that if you have something that's countable, anything that's countable, you can know that the amount of it is going to be a finite amount. And more than that, just as an extra point, if I have a chelik, a part of something, and that part is finite and countable and finite, therefore the whole is also going to be finite. It doesn't matter that I can't count all the grains of sand. Once I have a couple of them, I know that those are finite because I could count those. Therefore, the whole of them is going to be finite as well, because the whole is not qualitatively different than the sum. The sum is just, the whole is just a sum multiplied. That's it. So if the sum is finite, if part is finite, then the whole is also going to be finite as well. You're never going to have added the parts and eventually get to infinity. It doesn't make sense because, again, you can't reach infinity. Okay, so we've established that anything, any space, any digit, any number that you could count is finite. If I could count a part of it, I could also count the whole of it as well. Just to speak out, when mathematicians use infinity, it's kind of not exactly accurate, because even if you could say that, let's say between the digits 1 and 2, you could have an infinite amount of digits, it's not really true. You can have a never-ending amount of digits. You keep counting, because 1.01 or 1.001 or 1.0001. That's true that that's never ending. That is true, but it's not infinite. As we said, it's not infinity. It's still, each digit that you count is a finite digit, which is why 1 to 2 you could get from 1 to 2. Okay. So that's the first stage of what we're discussing, that the difference between infinite and finite, that means anything countable is finite and it cannot be infinite. That's what we have so far. Okay. Now, next point. You know what? Just to wrap up with this one point, let me give another analogy and to get to a point which we're going to need for the next point. The analogy would be if I see somebody putting jelly beans in a jelly bowl, in a bowl, and every time the bowl gets filled up, it magically expands. Okay, so the guy's putting jelly beans one after the other, after the other, after the other. The bowl keeps expanding, So he, in theory, could go on putting jelly beans there forever. Are the amount of jelly beans there finite or infinite? Well, if I could count a part of it, and I can count a part of it, I could take some out and 5 jelly beans, so then the entire amount is also going to be finite, because at no point will it ever cross the threshold between finite amount to an infinite amount. It doesn't happen. Once part of it is finite, the whole thing is finite, and since it's countable, then the whole thing is finite. Let me add one other point, which we're going to need for in a moment. If I were to tell him to stop adding jelly beans and start removing jelly beans. So the question I want to ask is it possible that he will never stop removing jelly beans? That he will be removing jelly beans forever? Is that a possibility? The answer to that is obviously no. I think we can all intuit that should be true, that at some point he's going to get down to 0 jelly beans. That's true. The answer why, the understanding is very simple, because once you have a finite amount of something, there is a beginning to it. If you stop him for a moment, you have a set amount, let's say 100,000 jelly beans. It's impossible that you're going to go on removing jelly beans and never stop, because once you have the 100,000 amount, so you get down to 0. Again, once things are countable, that they're limited. Once they're limited, they can be diminished. You could take away from them, you can minus from them, and you'll get eventually to 0. There's no way you could say that if he removes jelly beans, he will be never stopped to remove jelly beans. Eventually, he will get down to 0. You could take away. You could add to an amount. If you could add to an amount, you could take away to that amount. If you could take away that amount, you get to 0. And that's what finite is. A finite amount is. You could add to it. You could also take away from it. Okay, so these jelly beans are finite amount of jelly beans, and eventually that means if you take them away, you'll get to 0 jelly beans. Okay. Let's go to the next stage. Once we establish this, we need to go to the next point. The next point is what's called the law of causality. The law of causality, in simple terms, says that for every effect, there has to be a cause. Let's explain it in the way that we need for our conversation. For our conversation, we need to know the following thing, that anything that exists in the world that we know of right now, let's say, anything that exists in the world, let's just say for now, had a reason why it exists as opposed to not exist. And that reason is called its cause. So if I have a table, the reason why the table exists is because a person, a carpenter, took pieces of wood together, formed them, fashioned them in the shape of, one piece of wood like this and the 4 legs, and created what we know as a table. So he had the material, he formed them in a certain way, and that's why the table exists. The cause, we'll just say for now, we're going to lump all the causes, the different types of causes we'll discuss at some point, but the cause for now was the material, the wood, the form of the table. If it had a different form, it would be a bookshelf, let's say. So the form plus the material, and the carpenter was the one who brought it into existence. So all these are its causes. These are the reasons why the table exists as opposed to not exists. You can do this with anything in the world. Anything in the world will have a reason why it exists as opposed to not exist. So for you yourself, the reason why you exist as opposed to not exist is because your parents. And the chair has a reason why it exists opposed to not exist. The refrigerator has a reason. Anything you do in the world will have a cause, needs a cause, because non-existence is its standard. The standard will, can't say existence of something, but the standard status of something, let's say, should be non-existence. You don't need a reason why something doesn't exist. If a person has 10 children, I don't need a reason why he doesn't have 11. It's because he hasn't done something. That's why he doesn't have 11 children. If I don't have 2 watches, because I haven't created a watch. I don't need a reason per se why the watch doesn't exist. I need a reason why the watch does exist. And that reason will be its cause. Every effect, everything in the world that is in existence has a cause that brought it into existence. Again, it could have multiple causes, and we'll discuss the differences, again, between the types of causes. But for now, keep it very simple. Any effect that's in the world, anything that has existence, needs a cause as to why it is in existence, why it's continued in existence. Okay, so that's the law of causality. Law of causality says very simply that every effect has to have a cause. Okay, now let's go to so we have established 2 things right now. Thing number 1 is that anything countable, an amount of something, must be finite, and therefore it has a beginning, an end also to a certain extent, even though there's a never-ending amount of digits, but each digit has an end. The second thing we've established is the law of causality. Everything in the world that exists needs a cause as to why it exists. Again, you could do this with anything you like. You will see that in theory, the thing that you're talking about could have not existed, and there was a reason why it exists as opposed to not exist. Okay, so you have those 2 things established. Let's now put them together. Let's see where it gets us. If I ask you the amount of causes that were in a world, and by the way, just even before I go further, just one moment. Even sometimes people make this mistake, and they say, well, you could either have something caused or something's accidental. That's not really a fair binary. It's not actually true. Even things that are accidental are also caused. If I accidentally if you say you have a painting on one side, and one side of the room you have a painting, and the other side of the room you have a canvas with spilled paint on it, one is caused by the painter, and the other one is accidental, but it still had a cause. The cause was that I spilled the paint over. It was a random cause. It wasn't a thought-out cause. It wasn't, we'll call it a purposeful cause, but it was a cause nonetheless. So even things that are accident and random also do have a cause. It's not a thought out or purposeful cause. So it's not true to make it a binary of either has a cause or accident. Everything has a cause. Show me anything in this world that you will find that doesn't have a cause as a reason as to why it exists. The flowers are the way they are for a certain reason. Clouds are the way they are for a certain reason. The water, the rain is a certain way it is for a certain reason. Everything has a cause. Everything's existence has a cause, i.e., every effect has a cause. That's the law of cause and effect in very simple terms. The next stage is like this. If I ask you the amount of causes in the world, how many causes were there in the world? I'm not asking a specific amount. I'm going to ask, is the amount finite or infinite? Or is it infinite amount of causes, or are there a finite amount of causes? Take all the causes from the beginning of the universe. Tell me there's no beginning, whatever. The universe in its totality. You ask me the amount of causes, is it finite or infinite? Answer must be finite. Based on what we've established already, if something is countable, if something has an amount, then that amount will be finite. Since I could count the causes, and a cause has a limitation, it's here one day, it's gone the other, it's not infinite. The causes are limited, the causes themselves are limited, but therefore the amount also really should be limited as well. You could count the amount of causes. Like the grain of the sand, if I've counted some of the causes, I can know the entire total amount of causes is going to be finite as well. Just like if I count some grains of sand, I know the entire amount of grains of sand will also be finite. So I understand that the amount of causes in the world are finite. If I were to tell the person in charge or whoever's in charge of the causes, stop adding causes in the world and start taking them away, what's going to happen? Is it possible that he will never end or not? Is it possible that he will forever keep taking away causes or not? According to our logic, it is not possible. It is impossible that he will forever keep taking away causes. What that means is that by the jelly beans case, you could get down to 0 jelly beans. But by the causes, if I ask him to start taking away causes, he won't get to 0 causes, he'll get to 1. The reason for that is because if there was 0 causes, then nothing should be in existence. Another axiomatic point is that if you have nothing, and then you have something, let's say a thing A, that thing A couldn't have brought itself into existence. That's obviously impossible. Because, very simply, if you start with nothing, thing A is not in existence, and thing A can't bring thing A into existence, because that's circular. That's obviously axiomatic. And therefore, if there were 0 causes in the world, then the world shouldn't be here. But we do have a world. What we have to conclude is that there was a first cause, and that's it. The first cause was something that, as at the beginning of the chain of causes, again, you cannot have an infinite regression of causes. That's impossible. Mathematically, logically, philosophically, whatever it is, it's impossible, as we've established, that you can have a infinite regression of causes. So at some point, you have to get to the beginning of the causes. Again, in the jelly beans, you can have 0. But in causes, you can't. Therefore, there had to be a first cause. Now, this first cause, what I'm describing is something, it's a cause that is not an effect. It's just a cause, not an effect. And here's the question that we're going to leave with, and I think this question is an opening to fundamentally understanding what we mean when we say God. We're not there yet. I haven't said anything about the word God just yet, but it's a fundamental understanding of what we're going to discuss about it. This first cause, by definition, has to be something that had no cause. That's what it is. If it had a cause, it wouldn't be the first cause. The first cause means it's the first of all the chain of causes, but it itself couldn't have had a cause, because then it wouldn't be the first. It would be second or third or whatever it is. So obviously it has to be, the first cause has to be that there are no prior causes to this first cause. And this mathematically has to be. You cannot have an infinite regression of causes. You can't have 0. Therefore, it has to be a first cause which started all the chain of causes. The problem is as follows. The way we went about establishing this fact is by assuming the law of cause and effect. The law of cause and effect says that anything in existence has to have any effect has to have a cause. Well, what we're saying about this first cause is that it doesn't have a cause. So that seems to be a contradiction. How can we say on the one hand, that everything must have a cause, every effect must have a cause? On the other hand, we're saying that this first cause must not have a cause. Now, the two things have to be true. There's no other way around it. You can't get out of it. We know there's a laws of causality. Logically, experientially, we understand that there's a law of causality. That's the whole basis of the universe is built on the law of causality. However, at the same time, there must have been a first cause, which by definition means that this thing couldn't have had another cause. So how do we get around this issue? what do we do for this? So this is the question, the contradiction I'd like to leave you with. How do we get rid of this problem? On the one hand, understand that there is a law of causality, which means everything has a cause. On the other hand, the first cause must have not had a cause. And again, there's no way out of this. You have to answer this question. You can't negate the question because both things are true. There is a law of causality, that's for sure true. There could not have been an infinite regression of causes. Therefore, there must have been a first cause. Now, how does that fit with the law of causality? That's really the question that we have on the table.